This week's seminar speaker is Dr. Matiella Novak, who is currently a planetary mission scientist at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, or APL. Dr. Matiella Novak is a planetary geologist whose research focuses on studying volcanoes across the solar system. She received a bachelor's degree in geology from the University of California at Los Angeles. She then pursued a master's and PhD in geology from the Michigan Technological University. After that, she was a lecturer and education and public outreach director at the University of North Dakota. And then in 2010, she moved to her current institution, which again is APL, first as an education and public outreach lead. And then in 2014, she then started her current position. She's involved in several missions, and again, several education and outreach programs, and is interested in multiple planetary bodies. But today she'll be sharing some of her work related to volcanoes on Mars. And so with that, Dr. Matiella Novak, take it away. Thank you again for talking to us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I just want to say a big thank you to Dr. Rivera Hernandez for inviting me. I love the opportunity to talk about volcanoes on Mars, so hopefully we'll have a fun presentation today. And I just want to make sure you all can see my slides right now. Okay, great. So we're going to be talking about stratigraphic evidence for early Martian explosive volcanism in Arabian Terra. So let's see here. Okay, there we go, good. So just a little background about myself, and I appreciated the introduction from Dr. Rivera Hernandez. That was very thorough, thank you so much. As she mentioned, I got my graduate degrees, my master's and my PhD from Michigan Technological University, and my research was on studying, tracking the dispersion and transport of large volcanic ash clouds in the atmosphere, and this was primarily as mitigating the hazards to aviation. So we've heard some of these really large explosive eruptions when they put all these volumes of ash up in the atmosphere. The ash actually can stay in the atmosphere for weeks, and it can travel around the globe, and it is a major hazard to aviation. The ash can get sucked up into the engines, and you're talking about really tiny pieces of glass essentially, and that really messes up the engines. So there have been a few historical cases of planes flying in ash clouds and it causing problems, and one of the more well-known ones was from the Mount Redoubt, Alaska 1989 eruption. There was a large international flight, one of those really big planes unknowingly flew into the ash cloud, because as it turns out, as the ash cloud disperses, it gets thinner and it actually gets harder to visibly detect it with their eyes. So pilots have a really hard time distinguishing the ash clouds from regular clouds. And the biggest signal, I guess, that they get that they're in trouble is the first thing that happens is they start smelling sulfur. So that's where they know that there's a problem. There's, this strange smell that shouldn't be happening inside the airplane. So in this case, all engines failed while they were flying through the cloud, and luckily the pilot was able to identify right away what was happening, and it was a woman. She was able to turn the plane around and get back out of the ash cloud and was able to restart the engines. But as you can imagine, there was about like a 15,000 foot descent or something like that while there was no power to the plane. So very scary, and it is a hazard. So as was mentioned, I came to APL in 2010 as an EPO specialist, and because APL is such an awesome place to work, I was able to sort of that braided river concept make my way back over to doing science research where I am today. So this particular project that I'm working on with Patrick Welly and Jacob Richardson and Jacob Bleacher from NASA actually started at a DC volcano workshop. I can't remember, it was 2016 or 2017, but I essentially I had been working at APL, and I had been looking at CRISM data. I'm also on the CRISM science planning team, and I was like, there's these minerals in CRISM data that are related to altered volcanic ash. I think there's a story here that we can tell a little bit more. And that's how I ended up partnering up with the co-authors that I'm on this study with. Is I just went to a workshop and I started showing them, evidence that I had, and then we partnered up, and this is how the study formed. So to talk a little bit about volcanism and volcanism on Mars, there's a lot of volcanic history on Mars, a lot. It's definitely been one of the bigger processes on the planet throughout its history. And models and observations have suggested very high magma production rate during the Noachian and Hesperian time periods. And the most recognized volcanoes that we see right now on the surface are from the Amazonian. So we see a lot of evidence of volcanism from the Amazonian, but according to models, we should also be seeing a lot of volcanic evidence from the Noachian and Hesperian as well, and that is a little bit more hidden. So these are missing volcanoes. They're either buried, eroded, or disguised. And the Arabian Terra, the calderas that we're talking about in Arabian Terra today, are the ones that we think are disguised. And then there's also a lot of volcanoes on Mars, a lot of provinces and areas where volcanoes just exist. So I'm going to just quickly go through some of these, but again, the area we're focusing on today is Arabian Terra. So there's a lot of discussion right now over what types of volcanism could have existed on Mars. Some previous trains of thought are that Mars is purely basaltic volcanism. There could be no explosive eruptions, but we're starting to see now you could definitely have explosive eruptions associated with basaltic volcanism, even on Mars especially. And also we're seeing more varieties of volcanism on Mars too. So it's not just basaltic. There could be also more felsic and more volatile, heavy magmas as well that would produce large eruptions that you'd expect to see from some of these compositions of magma. So in the eruptions that we're talking about on Mars, we are looking for evidence of the large volcanic eruptions, the Plinian-sized eruptions. Those are the really big ones. And what happens is you've got hot ash incorporated into the atmosphere, and it gets transported away from the source vent, and it can actually be transported for thousands of kilometers away from the source vent. So if we did have these really large eruptions on Mars, we would see evidence of those types of ash deposits that have been transported several kilometers away from the source. So in the Tharsis volcanic province, this is probably one of the more well-known areas of volcanic features on Mars, and it's also home to the biggest volcano in the solar system, which is Olympus Mons. So the fact that we have the biggest volcano in the solar system on Mars definitely tells me that, there's possibilities for other very large eruption processes on Mars too, even if they're hidden from us right now, buried, eroded, disguised. Certainly the history is there that we could have these extremely large volume of eruptions just because we have the biggest volcano there as well. So it's a huge shield volcano, and there's other smaller volcanoes to the southeast of it. You can see there in the picture Arcia Pavonis and Ascraeus, I think it said. I know we always have a hard time saying some of these planetary names. So there's this is one area where there's plenty of evidence for a lot of volcanic activity and huge volumes of volcanic material erupted onto the surface. We've also got Elysium, and this is a smaller volcanic province than Tharsis, but it does also have some very large volcanoes in the area. So Elysium Mons is a very large volcano. It's the largest volcanic edifice in the province. And this one, again, this is an area that the more we study, we actually see more variety in the types of volcanism that could exist on Mars. So for this particular one, we've got lavas and pyroclasts associated with it. So again, more evidence for explosive volcanism on Mars. So the area we're looking at is Arabian Terra, and one of the first things that came out about this area that we thought that it could be the host of large volcanic eruptions is this paper that came out in 2013 by Mikowski and Bleacher that suggested huge caldera forming eruptions, super eruptions originating from Arabian Terra. And they looked at mostly the geomorphologic features of some of these patera areas that had previously were thought to be craters, but the geomorphology does not match up with what we would expect for craters and matches up more closely with what we would expect for calderas. So one of they're irregularly shaped, right? So craters are usually not that irregularly shaped, and the depth to radius ratio is also not what we would expect for a caldera. There's specific ratios that we expect from craters, and in this case, those ratios, the depth to diameter ratios, don't exist. So we're thinking it's closer to a caldera feature. The other thing is so the diameter ratio shows that some calderas are too deep to be impact craters. So that's the ratio that's off a bit. And the other thing is these are near fine-grained layer deposits with unknown origin, but have suggested to be a volcanic ash, dispersed volcanic ash. So those are some of the clues that we're like sort of focusing on of, okay, well, let's take this a little bit further and see what we can find in these areas. Again, just to emphasize the idea that when you have these really large super eruptions, caldera forming eruptions, that these ash clouds can be dispersed and transported thousands of kilometers away from their source. And a really good example of that here on Earth is the Yellowstone caldera. And we do see evidence of ash layers, very thinned out, but they're there even, all across the United States from some of the bigger historical eruptions of Yellowstone. And this is a model, sort of a present day model of what would happen if Yellowstone were to erupt present day. And as you could see, the ash would be widely distributed, and even the thickest part of the ash would be widely distributed. So again, just reemphasizing the idea that if we did have a very large caldera forming eruption, we should see ash everywhere. It should be all over the place, right? It would be out there. So the question is, do we have explosive calderas in Arabian Terra? This is a map just to give some context. The little, I don't know if you can see my mouse arrow, but these over on the western side of the region, we see these red, irregularly shaped features. These are the suggested calderas that we're looking at. And what we did is, excuse me, these lettered white circles right here are some of the areas that we looked for chrism data and topography data, combine them to see if we could find ash. And there's other studies as well, like Kerber et al. 2012, that looked at the friable layered deposits. Again, friable layered deposits just piques our interest even more that, okay, this could be volcanic ash. Volcanic ash certainly expresses itself in friable layered deposits here on Earth. So again, we had a benefit from this study that we could build upon a lot of other previous studies, and we were just really following a lot of other lines of evidence and trying to bring it all together. So what we had is, in the areas that we're looking at, we had a lot of mineralogical analysis suggesting altered volcanic ash. These papers that we were reading were more focused on the alteration processes, because I should mention that we're not actually seeing ash. What we're seeing is alterations of ash, right? Well-known alterations of ash. So there were a lot of previous studies that suggested they were looking more at the alteration processes and what that meant for climate change on Mars. But always at the end of the papers, there was always these little clues about, and this could be altered volcanic ash. And so we kind of, focused on those parts and said, all right, well, let's take this a little bit further. We also had the fretted terrain studies that I had just talked about earlier, along with studies modeling super eruptions and the distribution of ash. So we kind of already had in our head, if ash was distributed from a super eruption, we would expect it to see distributed in certain ways. We have models to help inform us of that. And then lastly, the geomorphological studies suggesting that those irregularly shaped features are not craters, but they're actually calderas. And if they are calderas, then they would have erupted huge volumes of ash that we should be able to still see somewhere. And so all of those things combine in the middle to say, okay, we should have some stratigraphic evidence for explosive volcanism. If it's there, we should be able to find it. All these other lines of evidence are pointing to that. So our methods were, the image there, it looks a little messy, but that's Arabian Terra. and we've got our distance lines, our distance away from the source volcano. So those are the basically almost like isopack lines if you think about looking at how far away ash is distributed from its source. You look at the distance versus the thickness of the ash. And so that's kind of what those lines are. We want to make sure we're always looking at the distance from the calderas. And then the dots, the green and black dots are data. So we have a lot of data to look at in the area. The green is prism imagery, and the black, I think, is high-rise imagery that we can make DEMs from. So well covered, a lot of good coverage for the data that we need to look at this area. The little yellow squiggly lines you see are actually canyons that have been mapped out. And our idea is because CRISM is so sensitive to dust cover, if we were looking more at crater walls or cliff faces where dust is not settling as much on those vertical surfaces, then we're more likely to be able to identify the mineralogy, and that is the case. We had definitely more luck and you could see the layering better when we were looking at crater walls and cliff faces. So that's why we wanted to map out the canyons to basically tell ourselves these are the places we want to look first. This is where the best data would be. So the hypothesis is if large pyroclastic eruptions occurred in Arabian Terra during the early times that we're talking about, Noachian and Hesperian, then they would have produced a series of ash deposits now altered, preserved in canyon walls. So that's what we're looking for. And yeah, we combined CRISM data with these DEMs from CTX DEMs to be able to look at the thickness of the layers and the distribution of those layers. So in terms of altered volcanic ash, the mineralogy that we were really focused on, and again, these minerals that we're looking at have all been identified in these areas through previous research. The focus of that research was different. The focus was to look at the minerals in the context of alteration through climate change, what the alteration says about changing climate on Mars. We're looking at these minerals as evidence for explosive volcanism. So it was helpful to already know that these minerals existed in these areas. We were just looking at them from a different perspective now. But the minerals we're looking at are jarosite, which is a hydroxylated sulfate associated with volcanic ash flows or falls. Also could be associated with lava flows as well. So, there's still some knowledge gaps that we need to fill in a little bit, but the more work we do, the more closer we're getting there. There's also hydrated silicas that are associated with altered volcanic ash, and the ones that we're really interested in because they're more commonly associated with altered volcanic ash are these clays, phyllosilicates, smectites, allophane and ammogalite, and montmorillonite. So some of these other minerals, the hydrated silicas and sulfates, could be associated with alterations of other types of volcanic products, not volcanic ash, but the phyllosilicates are most commonly, or more commonly, I should say, associated with altered volcanic ash. So we're looking at all these minerals, but certainly the clays give us a little bit more confidence, the phyllosilicates, that we're looking at altered volcanic ash. And as far as the morphology goes, the big, if anyone walks away from anything from this talk, I hope it's that it's not just the mineralogy or the geomorphology that we're looking at. It's a combination. These things have to be looked at together. And together, that's where we can say for sure, okay, well, not for sure, but with more confidence that this is a volcanic ash layer. It is thinning away from the source. The mineralogy is there. The geomorphology is there. Together, it tells the story. So it's not just one or the other. It has to be put together. And so that's what we're really, why the topography information is so important as well. It has to be looking at both those things together. So to look at regional trends, right? The regional trends are important. All right, so again, just going back to our study area, the white letters, the white circles with the letters in them are the data that we've looked at and identified altered volcanic ash in, and then we're able to map them versus the topography. And I do want to also point out that down in the very southeastern corner of this map image is the Perseverance landing site zone, Jezero crater. And so a lot of the mineralogy we're looking at as well is in this area. So it could also help inform us more about the history of this material in an area that we're exploring right now with the rover. So very timely to be working on this study as well and working in this particular area. So our results from those circles that you saw with the letters in them, looking at the chrism mineralogy versus the topography, that was published a few months ago in a paper that came out. And so this is the image. This is figure 2 from this paper. And what this is showing is basically all our methodology put together. So I'll start with the very right side, the chrism and lab spectra, identifying the minerals that are there. And there's all kinds of minerals in these images that we're seeing that are either possibly altered volcanic ash, like jarosite and the hydrated silicas, or diagnostic of volcanic ash, like the smectites and the montmorillonites, the aluminum smectites and the FeMg smectites. And so we're identifying these minerals. We see the spectras matching up with what we would expect to identify these minerals. And then we'll go back over to the oblique view on the all the way on the left. We're overlaying the chrism data with CTX DEMs to get an idea of the vertical distribution, the stratigraphic distribution of these minerals. And then that's what we map out in the middle and the cross sections. So in this paper, we focus on these 3 particular sites for the images, but there is more data, more analysis that we did, more areas. We have a lot more to do. This project is I don't want to say it's just getting started, but there's so much more data we could look at and so much more areas that we can fill in Arabian Terra. But for this paper, just to show where we're going, we showed these 3 images in particular. And as you can see from the cross sections, it was pretty obvious that these minerals are in layers, and we are able to look at the thickness of these layers and their distribution relative to each other, and to get a better idea of how these ash layers are distributed. And this is just close up because that image was a little bit farther away. Again, just looking at the minerals that we're seeing. And so in this particular area, we had the benefit of 2 craters, being able to look in 2 crater walls and seeing that there was this mantling deposit of amygdalite and allophane sort of on top. And this is, again, if this is a volcanic ash, we would expect it to be mantling. And so this conforms to what we understand of how volcanic ash is distributed. And then there's also these layers underneath that mantling deposit that are very widely distributed across this area, and we can get the thickness from those as well. And this, I will just emphasize again that this particular area, this image, chrism image in particular, there have been a couple of previous papers on them looking, very specifically at the mineralogy and the alteration, but always at the end of those papers is, and this could be volcanic ash. So this was one area where we were confident, like this is a good place to start using our methodology and see if we can get something out of this. All right, so altogether, this is kind of our results of looking at these chrism data and the CTX DEMs together. And what we're doing here is the sort of brownish orangish lines that you see back there, the brownish orangish figure with the lines that you see sort of in the back of this image. That figure is from a paper written by Laura Kerber modeling ash distribution. So after Bleacher and Mikalski and Bleacher's paper came out, some scientists picked up from there, Laura Kerber and her group, and decided, okay, if there is these large eruptions from these calderas, how would the ash be distributed if this happens? So they modeled it. They modeled what the distribution of ash would look like if they did originate from these calderas. And what we did is we matched up our results for what we observed in the chrism data and the CTX DEMs, together, the geomorphology and the mineralogy. We compared our observations with these models. And as you can see, they matched up pretty well. So we were really, it's just always exciting when different pieces of a puzzle start fitting together a little bit. It's really, it's very encouraging. And so the gray lines bars are the consistent with could be volcanic ash. That would be like the jarosite and the hydrated silicas. Those are the, we think this could be volcanic ash. And then the solid gray bars are the diagnostic. Like we're really confident that this is volcanic ash. These are minerals like montmorillonite and ammogalite and alphane that are more commonly associated with volcanic ash falls. So we're more confident that this could be it. So that's why we have those two different bars there. But either way, taken together, or even if you take away the minerals that are consistent, that we're not sure, even if you took those minerals away, what we're seeing is there is pretty good agreement between our observations and the models. And so again, that just gives us more confidence that we're on the right track. And as far as these over here, like F and G in these areas in the eastern part of our study area, we see the ash getting a lot thicker, and excuse me, the idea is, if the ash falls are coming from the west, they should be thinning out all the way to the east. But even the models suggest that there could be some secondary fallout or something that would create thicker deposits, and we're observing that as well, although they're quite a bit thicker than what the models are. And so then the question becomes, well, maybe there's other sources of volcanic ash in this area, not just those calderas that we're seeing in the western part of the area. Maybe there are more calderas distributed throughout Arabian Terra that we just haven't identified yet. So this is, basically conclusions to wrap this up. We are finding minerals consistent with altered volcanic ash, and it's including minerals diagnostic of altered volcanic ash found in multiple discrete layers at multiple locations. We are, let's see, and then the biggest, takeaway from this is that between 1 and 2, from the ash that we've measured in our stratigraphic columns, the thicknesses of these ash and the volumes of these ash, we're thinking between 1 and 2,000 caldera-forming eruptions over 500 million years. And that sounds like a lot, but remember, we have the biggest volcano in the solar system on Mars. So I always, remember that. There could have been a lot of volcanism on Mars, and, large magnitudes of volcanism on Mars, certainly. And we need more data. So this project is ongoing. We have future work that we're going to do. And we have a lot more CRISM data to look at throughout Arabian Terra. That image that I showed you before with all those dots everywhere, we've only looked at like 7, 8, 9 of those. And so we have a lot more that we can look at, and that's what we're doing right now. And we also want to incorporate THEMIS data with it as well, because that's another important physical geomorphology piece to the puzzle, is to look at the THEMIS data. So this is some ongoing work that we have to do. And I will also mention that we're so excited because we're actually going to be going out in the field this summer. We're going to the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, and there was a large eruption there. It's in Alaska in Katmai National Park, and there was a large eruption there in 1912 that deposited, deposited a lot of volcanic ash everywhere. And looking at mineralogy papers of that region, there's, the same minerals like montmorillonite and the smectites that we're seeing in our CRISM data is at the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. So we're going to go sample those and go back to the lab and look at them under a microscope and try to characterize them really well as an analog for what we're seeing on Mars. And that's it. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks, everyone.